All right. Welcome back, everyone. Or if this is the only session that you've been able to catch in the live event, then welcome. Thank you all for joining us. We're really thrilled about the event so far and really thrilled that Devin is here with us to send us off not only for the day, but for the year. I just wanted to hop on again real quick and thank you all so much for being our audience and for putting the attention and the work in to remove barriers to digital. It's something that certainly over the last year we've seen amplified. And let me change the interpreter real quick there. It normally when someone turns video on, it's popped up there. So thank you for pointing that out. I appreciate it. Yeah, over the last year, accessibility has really been amplified because everything's gone virtual. So really thrilled that you all are engaging with us in these conversations, and really thrilled that Devin's here. I hadn't seen or talked to Devin in years, but thought, hey, let's see if we can get Devin in on the program because there's a lot of really good information that's about to come your way. So Devin, without any further ado, I will thank you once again, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I think it's been a long time since we chatted. So thanks for looking me up. So hi, I'm Jennifer Singh. I'm gonna be talking today about some accessibility myths and hopefully give you some ideas about ways to improve your digital accessibility practice. And just for some context, kind of where I'm coming from, I use she, her pronouns. I've called Seattle home for about 10 years. And I do work broadly as an accessibility specialist. And currently I'm working as a technical program manager focused on accessibility education and tooling within the UX operations team at Shopify, which is a mouthful. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the talk, kind of how that works. But that's my current day job. If you're not familiar with Shopify, it is an online store platform. So I help the teams that work on the admin experience, basically, for people that are using the platform. I also help co-run the ALIC, which is the Seattle-based accessibility meetup. And I also teach at a local design school called the School of Visual Concepts. About once a quarter, I do a workshop on accessibility as well. So to keep my hand in. So the three myths I want to talk about today are disability is simple, accessibility is a technical problem, and accessibility is hard. So for the first one, I'm going to be talking a lot about how disability impacts people and the types of technologies that people use to access digital experiences. Probably going to be a repeat of some of the things that have already been discussed this week, but want to maybe do a different bit of context. For the second, I'll talk about some ways of doing accessibility work is way more complicated than being a technical problem to fix or solve. And finally, I want to talk about some of the things you can do to get past that feeling of accessibility being this big, heavy weight or this big monolithic thing to worry about. So for the first one, let's dive into disability is simple. So stat you've probably seen many times. It's just important to know that over a quarter, 26% of adults in the US have a disability that affects their daily lives. I work for a Canadian-based company, so I often usually throw in here that the number is about the same in Canada. It's closer to 22%, but this is, a lot of people. So common categories of disabilities that we typically talk about are dexterity and mobility, cognitive and neurological, vision, hearing, speech, and vestibular and motion. And I'll go into these in a little bit more detail as well. So one of the things that comes up a lot when I talk to people about disability and kind of that it's more complicated than people initially think is usually when I'm first talking to designers or developers or content creators who are new to accessibility, they'll ask questions like, what would disabled users do? Or what would blind users do, for example? They're thinking about it as kind of like a monolithic group. But it's very important to understand that disabled is not a user type or even a persona or even 6 personas for using those 6 categories. And this is because disability is often dynamic or situational or contextual. There's a group on Twitter that uses the hashtag no end in sight or variations thereof. This is a group that was started by Brian Bennis. It is a group of people that talk about chronic illness. And about this topic, she wrote an essay called My Disability is Dynamic, which is available on Medium. And in this essay, she talks about how in mainstream culture and media, disabled usually refers to people with static and visible disabilities. And so if I tell someone that I am disabled, I must explain that not all disabilities are visible, and also not all disabilities are static. And so this is something I try to talk about with folks, because they, again, if they're thinking about disability as kind of this monolithic thing, they might not be thinking about how variable it might be day to day. And a really helpful way to frame this is the social model of disability, which explains that disability is a mismatch between a person and their environment, the environment that's been designed around them or for them. And this model is in opposition to the medical model, which is kind of instead a way that we talk about disability as sort of a failing or something to be overcome in the person. So the social model is an idea I'm coming back to again and again, especially when we start talking about technical solutions. But I think this is a helpful way to think about disability when we're talking about usability work. So just to give you an example of a dynamic disability, I have fibromyalgia and depression, which is a chronic pain disorder. And it's very dynamic. It's quote unquote invisible, and it impacts me really differently day to day. So on a good day, I can usually get away with having stiff joints in the morning. I have a heating pad. I do some different things to make myself more comfortable. But on a bad day, it's much more complicated. I usually have some sort of pain that isn't really easily treated with things like ibuprofen. I get migraines a lot. Brain fog is a common thing, or fibro fog, where you just can't think very clearly, which can lead to sensory processing issues and can also lead to problems with balance and coordination. So depending on the day, depending on how tired I am, depending on maybe what I ate the day before, how I feel really, really varies. And this is not uncommon. About 22% of Americans have some sort of chronic pain disorder, and this is just one example of a dynamic disability. The other thing that people often get stuck on when I first start teaching them about accessibility is they kind of get hooked onto screen readers as kind of the example of assistive tech. And that's also more complicated than this. So not only do disabled people have very varied experiences, the tech that they use varies and maybe varies day to day. So I try to push people past screen readers as soon as possible, because there's so many different types of assistive tech. And people with disabilities will use a wide variety of assistive software or hardware tools, depending on their situation, depending on the context, depending on lots of factors. So just to give you some examples, there's the traditional keyboard that we think of, but there's also other things that either are different types of keyboards. There also are keyboards that don't have keys, like the OrbiTouch, which is kind of two big joysticks. So this idea of sort of what typing is and how people do typing can really vary. And people might have very customized devices that help them do that. Another example of a type of assistive tech that isn't a screen reader is voice control in macOS, or there's similar tools in other types of devices. The goal here is to interact completely with your voice. Voice control is kind of the macOS answer to Dragon, which is available for Windows. And so you can either use the names of controls to call out those controls and manage them. You can also create a grid or a numbering system that lets you interact with the screen, scroll, all those different types of things. I'm talking about this one a little bit more later as well. And another example is eye tracking. So this is just another way with people with dexterity and mobility issues might interact with the computer. There's no touching at all. So you're using your eyes to move the mouse around or to move some sort of cursor around and to interact. There's also high contrast. There's lots of different ways to do that. This is an example of high contrast on Windows, where it basically gives you a completely new or completely customizable set of colors for the content. This works in the browser as well as at the operating system level. And it also kind of color codes different content. So this is a thing I sometimes show to developers when they are really excited about building a button out of a div for no reason. And I will show them how it kind of breaks down when you look at with something like this, it's color coding things based on how they're implemented. So I'll talk a little bit more about high contrast stuff in a little bit as well. Another cool tool that people sometimes don't know about is reader mode that's built into Safari and Firefox. It lets you strip out ads, navigation, sharing controls, all that extra stuff that's not the article, if the article is marked up appropriately. And so I have an example here from the Shopify Help Center, which is a functioning article. It's a description of how to do something. And here's what it looks like in Safari in reader mode. So by default, it does a lighter text on dark background. You can alter the font. You can change how big the font is. It just makes it easier to read. And Firefox recently came out with a similar one. The defaults are a little bit different. It basically uses a print style sheet, but it also gives you some controls that you can listen to the audio instead, or you can, it looks like it has some Pocket integration too. You can save it for later for reading. So for kind of personal example, to use myself as an example again, I use a MacBook for work. And that good day example, when I'm just kind of stiff, my default is I use a split keyboard, which I'm happy to talk about split keyboards forever. Highly recommend them if you have any sort of elbow or wrist or hand pain. I've got my split ergonomic keyboard, and I also have a rollerball mouse. So this is my kind of general setup. This is what I'm using right now. On a bad day, I might work in bed. I might just be having a hard time interacting. And so I might use different tools or additional tools to get work done. I spend a lot of time writing for my job, shocking. So if I'm on my Mac and I'm having a hard time with my hands, I might rely on dictation on Mac. If I'm working in Google Docs for any reason, I have to use their version of dictation, which is called voice typing, I believe, because the native one on my Mac doesn't work with Google Docs. So I might have to use two different dictation tools. And I also use high contrast. I don't use the high contrast mode that's built into Macs. I don't really like that one so much, but I do use the high contrast plugin that's built into Chrome. And for a kind of meta discussion of this, I gave an intro version of this talk recently and was putting together the deck for that. And I just wanted to show an example of what that high contrast tool looks like. So this is a screenshot of my other version of my deck that's in Google Docs with those tools I just mentioned, the different dictation tools and the high contrast screenshot. And this is what it looks like with color inversion in the browser plugin. So it literally flips all the colors. So all the things that we've done to make sure that color contrast works well normally carry through here. It just flips them around. Another version of this that I use sometimes is this yellow on black, which is I find really helpful for days that I'm feeling like I'm getting a migraine. This really strips out all the color. And so I'm really looking at just the content and assuming that things are laid out and marked up in a way that I can see stuff without using color. So when I teach workshops about disability and accessibility, either at SVC or at Shopify, I sometimes will have my students do this little matching exercise to compare different types of disabilities to different good practices. And when you first do this feels very neat and tidy. So I have a few examples here of positive experiences. So providing keyboard support, providing good use of color, clear structure and labels, auto-playing media and captions and transcripts. So at first it's like, this is pretty easy. Good keyboard support is good for people with dexterity issues, and color is for people with vision issues, and clear structures and labels help with cognitive, and auto-playing media is bad for people with vestibular disorders, and captions and transcripts are good for people with hearing issues. And that seems really straightforward and really tidy, but we know it's not that simple. There's in fact a lot of different things that might be helpful for different people that have different types of disabilities or multiple types of disabilities, which is often also the case. So the whole point of this is that I want you to be thinking too about how sometimes we start to think from a very solution-oriented solving. We want to solve the problem and we kind of silo our solutions for different types of people, which can sometimes actually create barriers for other people, depending on their situation. So basically, we don't want to silo our solutions into support for one type of disability or another, because you don't necessarily know why someone's using a particular tool or why they have a certain setting turned on. So instead, I think it's helpful to think about creating disability-friendly experiences. And this is a different way of thinking about kind of the accessibility checklist. This is more thinking about it kind of proactively. And this is a way to think about disability as a collection of experiences rather than like a monolithic group of people. So a few things I recommend are thinking about input types. So you want to support those different types of devices. You want to support those different modes of doing input, whether they're, by touching the screen or typing or speech or anything like that. You want to make sure that people can input information into your website or app using any of those means. You want to assume that people are going to use different ways of thinking and processing information. That might mean the way that they want your site organized. It might be the way that they sort of are taking that information in and going with it. But you don't want to assume that everyone is going to be approaching whatever you're building from the same perspective. You want to have alternative media for any visual or audio content. Again, you don't want to assume that, say, someone doesn't want described audio and also captions. You don't want to assume that someone just wants a transcript. It might be more helpful for them to follow along with captions. Basically, always have different ways for people to get at the same information, regardless of what their preference is. And you always want to give people control over motion and movement. It goes for animations, it goes for avoiding auto-playing video, basically anything that you don't want. You want people to have as much control over what they see moving as possible. So I talked right now a lot about technical solutions or examples of technical things. And I've just told you that the second myth is accessibility is a technical problem. So let's dig into that a little bit more. So the reason that accessibility is not a technical problem, and the reason that we can't solve it with technical solutions is because the lack of accessibility and the lack of skills to address accessibility is a cultural problem. And that cultural problem is rooted in ableism. So this has shifted a little bit, I think, lately. And if this is an idea that you want to dig into more, I really, really recommend my friend EJ Mason has a wonderful talk called Accessibility is a Hydra, which you can find on YouTube. That really digs into this idea. But the more people I talk to now regularly are starting to get at this idea that, oh, yeah, there's like a larger cultural problem that is causing this. It's not just a thing we can fix with some buttons or some ARIA. So I feel like there's been a positive shift, but it's still definitely a work in progress. And part of this problem too is that most of the resources that we have around accessibility, digital accessibility, are technical. If you are looking online for solutions to problems, or you're looking online for discussions about accessibility, they're often very oriented to testing and very oriented to developers. And one example of that is that the primary tool we use to measure accessibility is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a technical document. It is written as a technical document. It's very much for people that read technical documentation. And this isn't at all like a shot at the folks that work on this, but it is not always approachable for people that don't have a technical background. And there's definitely content in here that is good for UX practitioners and non-technical people, but it's really presented in a very tech-focused way. And there definitely are resources out there for folks like designers and writers and researchers, but it's usually kind of the same stuff over and over again. It's like, use good color contrast, use simple language, test with users. There's a lot of why and not a lot of how in those types of discussions. And that's because the how really varies project to project and team to team. And there's not kind of good universal guidance around this because there's just like a lot of moving parts. So an example of what I often see happen, and you can probably see some variation of this in your organization. And again, I'm coming from a kind of digital product perspective and like a digital consulting perspective. So reimagine this cycle to whatever fits your particular organization. So what often happens is that you have a live website or an app that you're auditing to see if it's accessible, something that's already been launched. And then hopefully you get a list of issues, whether that is from an external audit or something you do internally. And then hopefully those issues are fixed. Sometimes they just go in the backlog, but hopefully they're fixed. So you fix the issues that were discovered, you release those updates, but often you haven't actually changed anything about your process that led to those issues in the first place. So then what usually happens is there's some sort of update that goes out, or you redesign or rebuild the app, and then you get the same problem over and over again, where accessibility is always kind of this thing that happens at the end, which stresses everybody out, makes people burnt out, and makes it really difficult to kind of become part of your actual workflow. Another thing that also often happens, and I'm going to pick on Accessibility here, and other companies that do overlays, the idea that the accessibility is a technical solution also affects this sort of thing. So if you're not familiar, accessibility overlays, quote unquote accessibility overlays, are typically a third-party product that a company says that put this plugin on your website and it will make it accessible. And there's examples of this actually making accessibility worse. It often conflicts with people's chosen assistive tech. There's lots and lots of kind of moral, I think, reasons why this is also not a great solution. But it gives people this false idea that you can just install a script or install a plugin and your website will become accessible. And I have some screenshots from folks that have talked about this on Twitter. Haben Girma talks about how they claim to provide quick and easy automated accessibility solutions, but she's encountered barriers on those types of websites as a blind person. Chancey Fleet also talks about being a blind person and trying to access websites that use these tools. There's a discussion about that there's an organization, someone installed these on a website for an accessibility conference. Everyone got really upset. They had to apologize. And a lot of this comes down to something that Shell Little mentions in a tweet I have here, and Ashley Boyer, that basically it makes you feel good to have this type of plugin on your site because it's like, we did something, but it doesn't actually address the underlying problem, which is that your site isn't accessible in the first place. To add on to this, another problem is that the people that build websites and apps are not as diverse a group as they should be. And there's been lots and lots of discussions about how diverse teams make better products and make better services. Sid Harrell has an excellent book called A Civic Technologist Practice Guide, and it's not specifically about accessibility, but it is about basically doing good user-focused work in a technical space. And a quote that I really like from this book is the following. So people design for themselves by default, and people who are already overrepresented and accustomed to being in spaces where their group dominates may not even notice their own overrepresentation or the harm they can produce at scale. And there's been a lot of discussions lately about kind of harm in tech, things related to race, things related to class, and this is just another facet of that. Our teams that typically build things are not full of people that have disabilities. So remember at the beginning I mentioned that 26% of adults in the US have some kind of disability. And again, this may vary based on where you are, this may vary based on what your organization does, but in general, I'm going to assume that 26% of the people on your team or in your organization don't have a disability. And that means that, the people that are building these things are not representative of the people that are consuming them. So a few examples of things that I think you need to actually make this work systemically are some sort of holistic continuing education about disability and about technology and how those intersect. How this exactly happens at your org is going to vary widely based on what your org does. I'm going to give some examples of things I've done and I'm currently working on later. Including people with disabilities as part of your team and your process. That might include them as people doing usability testing, but also just like having people with disabilities in your org and not just in accessibility roles, really brings home like, hey, this is a large population that isn't currently being served very well. Continuous improvement of processes and workflows. So again, trying to avoid that situation where you're just doing accessibility at the end and actually making it part of the work that you do. And a huge thing is that accessibility is actually planned and is always part of the current work. And that includes things like minimum viable product releases. There was a little bit of discussion on Twitter, I want to say a few months ago, how does time work anymore? About their audio post type and how it didn't support captions out of the box. And they were like, oh, we'll do it later. And people were like, no, you're not going to do it now. So how do we trust that you're going to do it later? You didn't include people with hearing issues as part of your user base for this product. The other part of this that's really tricky is that it really requires everyone. Often when I've talked to companies as a consultant, or even now, sometimes I'll talk to folks and they assume that accessibility is something that developers do or something that designers do, but they don't think about the larger culture of the organization that needs to support that. So to make any sort of product or service accessible, you really have to have the buy-in of literally everyone in the organization. That includes executives, that includes anyone doing research, that includes people recruiting staff, that includes people that work in the marketing department. There needs to be some baseline understanding across the board that everything that the organization produces or consumes internally needs to be provided in accessible formats. So that brings me to my third myth, which is accessibility is hard, which I just told you a lot of things that are hard. So you're probably thinking right now, like, that's rude. But the truth is that everything is hard when you don't know enough about it. If you don't know where to start, if you don't have the vocabulary to do the research or to know, like, what am I responsible for? So that's why this feels so big, is because it feels like this big, huge problem. I mean, ableism is a huge problem, but there's ways to kind of chip away at that in our little pockets of whatever it is that we individually do. So think back when you were first learning a craft. It might be your work, say you're a designer. It might be woodworking or knitting or any sort of craft. You learn certain principles about kind of what the standards are and what what this craft is about. You learn how to use certain tools. You learn maybe technical standards or legal or ethical standards for the work that you do. You gain some real life experience, and you have failures and successes, and all of those things impact your ability to get better at your craft. You learn what works for you and what doesn't. You learn what works for your users and what doesn't, in the case of doing digital or product work. So really, this comes down to not being an expert in accessibility. I don't want to assume that everyone is going to become an accessibility expert. And I also think it's really difficult to teach empathy, which is the whole topic in and of itself. So a thing I like to tell people is that accessibility work at scale within an organization or even just within a team is really about literacy and practice in accessibility. It's not about becoming an expert or about empathy. You should have empathy for your users, of course, but really this is just another thing that we should be doing, because that's what doing user-focused work means. On the topic of empathy, there's a really great essay by Tatiana Mack called Compassionate Action Over Empathy that you can find on their website that dives into this concept of empathy and how it's difficult to teach and how it's very difficult as a kind of metric to get people to actually do stuff. So I use the word literacy, and I use that very specifically in my previous life. Before I came into tech, I was a librarian. I studied library science. I worked in a bunch of different types of libraries, and something I found very useful from those days is this idea of literacy. And literacy is really about helping people grow to be confident in doing, in the case of library science, research, but really anything, really helping people figure out how to understand resources, how to decide if they're valuable, and how to move forward with them. So there's a few kind of steps to this, and you'll see different versions of this in different resources around library science, but it kind of boils down to about 5 things. One is that you learn how to discover resources efficiently. So that's literally, Googling or using your card catalog, for example. So can you find stuff? And then can you evaluate whether or not that stuff is good? Is this going to be useful for you? Is this the right level of granularity for what you need? That kind of thing. You also learn to understand the context. So where is this coming from? Who is saying this? For example, I'm going to trust, something written up about how JAWS behaves for a person that uses JAWS every day, other than a person who's just using JAWS for testing, for example. The next thing that you do from this is that you create new work. So that might be research, it might be a website, it might be whatever it is that you do day to day, but you're taking that information that you learned and actually applying it to your work. And then ideally, you're also participating in some sort of community of practice. This could be a guild within your company, it could be a Slack group, it could be an office within your organization, but you have some group of people that you talk to that you're sharing ideas and getting ideas and kind of keeping up to date. And there's lots of different ways that you can do this. So again, this is going to depend a lot on your organization, but there's usually some sort of organization-wide training, very low, sort of 101 style training around disability and accessibility. You might have handbooks or some sort of onboarding documentation for different roles within your organization that include accessibility as part of that craft. If you have a design system, accessibility information about how to use that or how accessible different components are can live in that documentation. And that could be public or not, depending on where your design system lives. Some sort of tooling. So there's lots of tools to use to do testing these days. And obviously automated testing is not going to get you at 100%, but starting somewhere and using tooling regularly when you're releasing new products or releasing new services is super helpful before things become public. Including it in your rituals. So by that I mean, if you have team meetings and you're talking about sort of priorities, are you talking about accessibility? If you're doing code reviews or design reviews with teammates, are you talking about the accessibility of the things that you're working on? Is it part of the conversations that your team is having? And that last part is community, which is really, again, going to vary based on kind of where you are. You might have a very robust community within your organization. You might have online friends that provide that for you, but having some place to kind of go is really valuable. Yesterday I was watching A11YTO they've been kind of doing a rewatch series from some of their talks from last year, I think, that were online. And they did one yesterday for Sarah Higley's talk about debugging accessibility issues. And one of the things that she talked a lot about was having that community and having people that you can bounce ideas off of, because accessibility work can often feel very isolating if you're, like many people, kind of the only person in your organization. So having whoever that is really important. So let me really quickly show you an example workflow that I think is more robust, if you will, than the one I gave you earlier. So having some way to include disabled users in the product scope. So that might be part of your personas, it might be part of your user interviews, whatever it is that you do when you're first creating a new thing, but being explicit and saying, yes, we're building an accessible product. Disabled people will use our product because disabled people use everything. You start thinking about the accessibility early in the design process. So if you're making mock-ups or talking about what the experience should be like, you're talking about accessibility at that point and not worrying about it at the end after you've already designed, after everything's been signed off. So you do some sort of usability testing of your prototypes. There's lots of different ways to do that, but getting feedback early from users is really important. And then when you're building this stuff, you're testing it as you go. So you're probably using automated tools as you're making updates, and you're ideally testing with assistive tech, so when you're building new features to make sure you're not missing anything really obvious. So then you release the work. It goes out into the world. And then maybe people still find issues because it's software and there's always going to be issues. And you triage those and you address them just like you do any other issue. The thing that I always get stressed about is when people will they'll take accessibility feedback, but they don't actually do anything about it. They don't triage it as part of their regular workflow. So any way that you typically take feedback from users, take that feedback from users with disabilities the same way. So I want to end by talking a little bit about some of the things I'm working on that fit in some of these different categories of work that you might find helpful. So one thing I'm doing this year is I'm focusing on training managers, which we'll talk a little bit more in a second. I'm pushing teams to do user interviews and prototype reviews with disabled users really early. I'm building out our virtual assistive tech lab, which is kind of one of my answers to our current digital sort of environment. And I'm also doing collaboration with our research operations group, which you probably don't have one of those at your organization, but you might have some other similar allies. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. So why managers? You might be thinking managers don't write code or design things usually, but they have a lot of say in who is doing those other types of work. So they usually have some sort of input into projects, kind of what work is planned with the people that own those products or projects. They often also hire people. So making sure that managers understand what to look for in designers or developers or content creators, making sure that those people have those accessibility skills. And they often also set standards for processes and improvement because they're usually supporting multiple people within a team. They're seeing when those processes or those standards break down, and they have some input into standardizing those kind of more across the organization. So one of the things I'm doing is going to be training managers to be able to recognize these things and help them to better support their teams to do usability work. So another thing I'm doing is we've partnered with Fable, which is a usability testing platform. They're based in Toronto, and they have a platform where you can organize and recruit participants to talk about pretty much anything you want to talk about. People that use assistive tech every day, they can do code reviews for you, basically. They can do usability testing. They've got lots of different services. This is what we're currently using to get that feedback early in our processes. The virtual assistive tech lab I mentioned, Shopify pre-COVID was a largely office-based company. We've since gone digital by default. And so all of the kind of trappings of original office life are gone for folks that did work in offices. And so that also means we don't have AT labs or device walls or things like that anymore. And so my goal with the virtual assistive tech lab is to give some people guidance on when to test with assistive tech and how to, and also including video demos and stories from people that use assistive tech every day so they can get a better sense of how they should be doing that testing as well. Also, I like to brag about my team. So I mentioned I have collaborated with the research ops team at Shopify, and together we're the research operations and enablement team. And this team is amazing. We're very small, there's only 5 of us, but our focus is really on helping people connect with users of various types who use our products. And so it's been really great to work with folks that do the same type of programming work around research, because we're trying to answer a lot of the same questions and help people with the same types of problems. When to do this in your work, how to incorporate it into your work in a way that isn't disruptive, and kind of what are different ways that we can try that out. So we collaborate and experiment a lot with different types of office hours, different types of support, different types of documentation. And it's been incredibly valuable to have some folks to bounce ideas off of, even though they're not accessibility folks specifically, but it's a lot of the same ways of thinking. So it's been really valuable to have like a little group of people I can collab with. So just a few resources I really recommend to wrap up. There's, if you're just starting out on your accessibility journey, or you want to dive more into this really usability holistic approach. Accessibility for Everyone by Lara Kalbig is a great intro book. The A11Y Project is an amazing website that has a lot of really good introductory material and a lot of good best practices for testing. A few other books I really recommend. So I mentioned A Civic Technologist Practice Guide by Sig Harrell, highly recommended. Design Beyond Devices by Cheryl Platts talks a lot about multimodal design. So not just, phones and screens, but all sorts of interactive experiences. And Mismatch by Kat Holmes has a really great overview of how inclusion actually impacts design and vice versa. Another book I highly recommend is Disability Visibility, which is a collection of essays edited by Alice Wong. And also just a few hashtags if you're looking online. There's lots of people with disabilities who talk about their experiences on Twitter. I mentioned the New England Site group, NEIS Void is their hashtag. If you're also just looking for people talking about accessibility, A11Y. And some people also use the disability Twitter hashtag to talk about their experiences. So I'm gonna leave you with an inspirational quote. One of my friends at work, Ryan Frederick, who I used to work with on the design system team at Shopify, said something really brilliant once, which I was immediately like, can I use this in every presentation forever? So we were talking about accessibility process and how people get very stuck on the idea of making something perfect before they want to release it. And Ryan said, accessible is better than perfect. So if you don't take away anything else from this talk, I just want to invite you to start thinking about doing accessibility work with whatever little bit you can. It doesn't have to be perfect. Nothing is perfect, and making things that are imperfect but accessible is going to be better in the long run. So thank you very much. And thank you to the interpreters.
Devin, I've been keeping an eye on channels. So far, there have been several comments. There was one question about your slides. Are you going to make those available or shoot them over to us so we can get them up on the conference site?
Yes, I will share them. Yeah, I will share them right after this.
Okay.
And yep. Yes, we'll do. Yeah, happy to answer any questions.
I haven't seen any questions. I've just seen a lot of affirmation.
That's nice too.
A lot of comments just reinforcing the points that you're making, that there's a reason that those statements are mythological in nature. I think that was a really great angle to take with it. So thank you so much for being a part of the event and for bringing this message in. Here's a question from Monica. How did your team come about? Was it something that you spearheaded the creation of?
That's a great question. So it happened kind of organically. So the reops and enablement team happened. I used to be in a different group within Shopify that was kind of best practices oriented. But Shopify is a very large, very quickly continuing to grow company. And so I wasn't necessarily positioned super well for that. There was a little bit of a reorg of some UX folks, and I basically got invited to join the UX operations team, which handles not just research, but like tooling and education and all those different types of things for people to do UX work. And so that made a lot of sense. And then it also made sense. We were also figuring a way to kind of democratize doing research. So it wasn't just people that have a research background. So the research ops group formed for that reason. And because we were doing very similar work, it made sense for me to be part of that group. So I'm not aware of other orgs that kind of address it that way. It's still an experiment. We're trying it out. But it's been really great it's also been really great to kind of get affirmation for how accessibility fits into the broader picture. So like, it's nice to talk to researchers who don't have accessibility backgrounds, but the methods we're talking about and kind of those holistic approaches work the same in research as well. So it's been really nice to try out different ways of teaching and sharing with them, and it feels less like I'm just throwing stuff into a void, hoping it sticks. So that's been nice, just to kind of like collaborate with people that are doing similar work.
Yeah, it's been cool to see Shopify, Slack, a lot of the companies over the last 2 to 3 years, more than that for some, but I feel like over the last 2 to 3 years, people have gone, oh yeah, we need more people focused on this within the org. This isn't something we can farm out entirely. We might farm out and get some help here or there, but we do need to look at this as an ongoing sustainable program, as opposed to, I made a comment before a project that like, oh, we'll be done on this day. That's not how it works.
Right. Yeah. It's been really nice to like basically the whole re-ups idea is that these are skills. Again, it's like a literacy problem. It's more about providing people with skills and resources and teaching them how to use them, and less about becoming an expert researcher or becoming an accessibility expert or becoming a whatever expert. And yeah, our kind of general goal is to kind of raise the floor across the board. And then it's also starts to become more easy to identify people in the org that like maybe do want to become more expert level, or identifying like who might be good for mentoring folks that are trying to do this work. Like it's a good kind of group to filter. We touch so many teams. It's very nice to kind of you get that kind of cross section of getting a sense of who's really invested in user focused work, and then we leverage those people as much as we can. So it's pretty scrappy and pretty definitely experimental, but we've been really effective at getting out a lot of resources really quickly.
We're at time. There is another question if you're willing to field more. In the example workflow, you mentioned usability testing before automated tool testing. I may be mistaken, but my understanding is most organizations do the latter first and then the former, if at all. What is the advantage of not testing with automated tools before engaging people with disabilities in usability testing?
So thank you. I should have made that more clear. So in that case, I'm talking about definitely if you've already built something, run it through usability testing or run it through automated testing before you put it in front of people. Getting people before that is more about testing prototypes and ideas. So even more like user interviews, prototype reviews, or just getting feedback about, I know this isn't going to be necessary all the time, but if there's some new wacky interaction you're designing, you're completely redoing an application, you're building a big custom workflow, getting feedback early on about whether or not that's even a good idea can be really helpful, because you might avoid, you run the risk of building a thing that's technically accessible but not very usable. But if you get people, if you get feedback earlier in the process before you're even starting to build something, that can help avoid problems. So depending on your workflow, might make sense to have people come in during kind of design and then people come in later just to kind of like QA. But I think at least talking to people early in the process before you even have a built solution can be really valuable.
Awesome. Very good. I don't see any more questions. Again, just some more comments in the chat. With that, Devin, I think, again, I want to say thanks very much for being a part of the event. I think you've sent everybody out with some really good thoughts about just the approach and the thinking about accessibility. So, thanks. Great content. Really appreciate you making the time to join us. For everyone else,
thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, you're so welcome. It was great. It was great.